think that one of the most important things for people in Colorado to know about water is that it's a limited resource.
And that the supply of water doesn't always match where the demand for the water is.
We are all tied together by water in this state.
The Front Range is going to grow the equivalent of 5 new cities the size of Denver in the next 40 years.
The water future for the state of Colorado is going to be challenging.
The future is not going to look like the past.
Every drop of water that comes out of that tap is coming out of a river.
Water is precious, and the truth is that very few people really understand where the water comes from.
The story of water in the state of Colorado begins on the Continental Divide, where mountains shear the sky and rivers tumble down their flanks. The water that originates in Colorado is the most coveted in the nation, with 18 other states and Mexico thirsting for their share of this essential export. Tens of millions of people, billions of dollars of agricultural production, and trillions of dollars of economic activity all depend on rivers born in Colorado's mountains. Each drop is linked to vast webs of life, and every molecule can be converted to money that circulates through the global economy. The repercussions of how Colorado manages its rivers ripple across the planet. The age in which Coloradans can open taps and take for granted the universal ingredient of all life has ended. The American West has entered a new era of water urgency.
The Great Divide was put in our state for a very specific reason by the Congress, to hold the gold-bearing area against the Texas Confederates, preserving for the Union the Great Divide's mineral resource. But we got this greatest treasure of all, the headwaters of the 4 great rivers.
The Great Divide pierces the atmosphere atop the Rocky Mountains, splitting the state of Colorado into a west slope and east slope. Like Montagues and Capulets, the two sides have a long history of feuding. 80% of the state's water originates on the west slope, but more than 80% of Colorado's population resides on the east slope. From this mismatch between water supply and population has come human drama, culminating in courtroom clashes and in monumental feats of engineering. The South Platte, the Arkansas, and the Rio Grande gather volume as they run down the eastern side of the divide. Their waters are siphoned to the faucets of cities, the pipework of industries, the turbines of power plants, and thirsty landscapes that give life to crops. What remains flows to the Atlantic. The Colorado River winds its way west to the Pacific as it cascades down the spine of the continent. But a significant portion of its headwaters is rerouted eastward to farms and cities across the Great Divide. And after being used by downstream states and Mexico, the river that carved the Grand Canyon rarely reaches the sea. The topography and climate of Colorado are marked by extremes. From a low point of 3,392 feet above sea level on the eastern plains to the summit of Mount Elbert at 14,440 feet and the plateaus and canyons of western Colorado, dramatic differences in precipitation occur from place to place and from year to year. The only constant in Colorado's weather and climate is change. Rivers shrink to rivulets. Trickles can turn into roaring tides. As 2013 began, drought squeezed the state in its desiccating grip, Rivers withered and reservoirs emptied. But in September, torrents of rain fell on Colorado's Front Range in a biblical deluge that twisted steel bridges like children's toys. As dramatic as these swings in precipitation have been, climatologists warn that wetter wet periods might be on the way, and drier dry periods are almost certainly coming to Colorado.
Even without the influence of humans on our environment and our climate, the climate has still dished out some very inhospitable moments through history and will most likely continue and may even dish out more extreme conditions based on the changes to the environment that we probably have something to do with.
Colorado's largest water reserve is stashed in frozen vaults of mountain snowpack. 2/3 of the annual water flow occurs when the snow melts in late spring to early summer. The seasonal flux of rivers has historically led to a need for storage. Reservoirs created by damming rivers or diverting their flows offstream stockpile runoff from spring snowmelt and distribute it in the dry months of late summer and fall. Our Herculean efforts to control the flow of rivers have reshaped the landscape of Colorado, profoundly sculpting the state's historical and cultural identity in the process. We have moved water, and water has moved us. From this interplay between people and water, the story of Colorado branches and braids like a river. Clean water running reliably from city faucets is one of the great achievements of civilization. Throughout history, people have been plagued by horrors that lurk in contaminated water systems. A steady supply of safe water is a medical advancement as critical to reducing human suffering as penicillin. But a portion of the treated water used by cities of the Front Range is spread on lawns and landscaping introduced from moister climes.
The American people had a fixation on green. They lived in the eastern United States or in the Midwest or the South, and in the spring, summer, and much of the fall, when they looked at things, they were green. And so enormous efforts are made to take an olive green or sage-colored landscape and turn it bright green.
The short period of natural lushness in the West from late spring to early summer has been lengthened by the need to cultivate the land for food. From modest ditches to engineering marvels that move water across mountains, innovations in irrigation have allowed farmers and ranchers to transform vast stretches of burnt basins and tawny prairie into fields of green. Rivers that begin in Colorado turn the turbines of hydropower dams both within the state and beyond its borders. But the water levels of some reservoirs are dropping so low their turbines may not be able to generate power in the future. Farmers, families, business, energy producers, outdoor enthusiasts, and wildlife all require water, but they are forced to share limited supplies. In most years, there isn't enough water to ensure that every water demand is satisfied. Scarcity of this vital substance can lead to controversy and conflict. But in the history of Colorado, more ink has been spilled than blood. The majority of water disputes are settled in courtrooms, leading to legal mazes of bewildering complexity, and increasingly to negotiated settlements based on compromise. The ability to develop collaborative solutions to myriad water challenges will be tested in the crucible of frequent drought and rising population pressure that the future likely holds. The population of Colorado is expected to double from 5 million to 10 million around mid-century. And the Colorado Department of Natural Resources projects a statewide gap between water supply and demand by 2030. A gap that will emerge earlier in many places in the state. In Colorado and across the West, we are facing increasing demand on decreasing supply of a substance essential for life.
Historically, we've kicked the can down the road on a lot of water problems, and I don't think we can afford to do that anymore.
If we grow the next 5 million people in Colorado the way we grew the last 5 million people, that may not be a sustainable model.
If people know where their water comes from and where it's going, they're more likely to protect that resource. There's a long history of water before it starts coming out of that tap.
What we've learned from the ancestral Pueblans is that they're able to harvest water under difficult conditions to serve their community needs and teach us a lot about not to waste and to preserve and to provide good stewardship to the water supplies that do exist.
Mesa Verde National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the largest archaeological preserve in the United States, stirs the imagination of visitors with stories that cling to its abandoned cliff dwellings. The ancestral Puebloans who created these stone cities harvested water that spilled from ledges when it rained. They constructed cisterns to store this precious substance, and their collective effort and careful stewardship of water allowed Mesa Verde to be continuously inhabited for at least 7 centuries. The abandonment in the late 1200s of this bustling metropolis in the desert coincided with a drought of wicked severity.
At 1250, perhaps 10 to 30,000 people lived in this area, which rivals the number of people here today. The next big drought that hit, there was just no way for that many people to survive on the landscape.
Before white pioneers poured into the Colorado Territory seeking gold and settling farms, the Ute lived in the mountains and western plateaus. The Navajo inhabited the deserts of the Southwest, and the Arapaho and Cheyenne roamed the eastern grasslands. These early inhabitants traveled over vast stretches of terrain, moving with the seasons in search of food and water. Although Colorado's rivers were not conducive to boat travel, they were essential to early explorers for navigation. These highways of the 19th century guided trappers and expeditions over the prairie, led them into mountain valleys, and laid out pathways through maze-like mesa country. Rivers provided travelers with water and abundant game. The long stretches of land between these sinuous oases appeared on early maps as vast blank places that were viewed as strange and hostile wastelands. As Lewis and Clark were returning from the Northwest in 1806, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike led an expedition into the southern part of the Louisiana Purchase. While trekking in search of the headwaters of the Arkansas River, Pike's journal recorded his impression of the parched monotony. These vast plains of the Western Hemisphere, Pike wrote, may become in time as celebrated as the sandy deserts of Africa. Major Stephen Long led an expedition in 1820 to probe the southwestern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase and was similarly underwhelmed by the landscape's potential to harbor an empire. The botanist and geologist for the expedition, Edwin James, produced a map that labeled the plains the Great American Desert.
The Great American Desert was a misnomer, and it was a lens through which the European settlers saw the landscape because they didn't understand the bounty that that landscape provided. We had an incredible ecosystem that existed that was so rich. The skies would be dark with birds, waterfowl, cranes flying through the air.
From the 1820s to the 1840s, rugged mountain men followed rivers into the Rockies to trap beaver, feeding a fashion craze for hats made from the animal's soft pelt. Beaver dams formed vast wetlands across the West. Perhaps no other animal save man rearranges the landscape so radically. When these industrious creatures were pushed to the edge of extinction, wetland habitat also vanished on a colossal scale as the West began to morph from unmapped wilderness to managed garden. By mid-century, government surveys led by pathfinders and cartographers such as Ferdinand Hayden and John Wesley Powell followed and mapped the rivers of what would become the state of Colorado, providing cartographic clues to terrain, resources, and potential railroad routes. Powell identified the West's limited water as its most salient feature. Credited with the first descent of the Colorado River, this explorer-scientist produced maps of the West with proposed boundaries based around watersheds, rather than arbitrary political divisions that severed rivers into separate parts. Powell predicted a heritage of conflict would result from the over-allocation and mismanagement of Western water resources. His ideas about grassroots democracy within the watersheds of the American West and his emphasis on cooperative effort to develop and share water resources were largely ignored and even ridiculed at the time, though today they are considered strikingly prescient. In the 1870s and 80s, as pioneers streamed into Colorado to settle the mountains and plains, railroads replaced riverbanks as the state's main thoroughfares. But as rivers diminished in importance as navigational aids, the water between their banks provided the key to unlocking the region's riches of soil and sun. The People's Ditch, carved from the dry earth of the southern San Luis Valley in 1852, holds the earliest water right in continuous use in Colorado. Almost every member of the community of San Luis helped to build this ditch from the Culebra River toward fields of fertile bottomland.
They had a vision. They looked up to the mountains and they saw snow and they saw creeks and they saw rivers and they saw barren ground that their homes were sitting on, and they said, you know what, if we can get that water over to us, we can grow something.
This earthwork irrigation channel was based on the acequia system of Spanish origin. Introduced to the desert Southwest by Franciscan friars, acequias can be traced back to the Moors of North Africa. Spanish and Mexican water law, which took hold in the lands drained by the Rio Grande, was geared toward promoting the common good of the community.
In the spring, you clean out the ditch, and those who turned out to do the work were those who got an allocation of water. Even currently, the Colorado legislature has adopted laws recognizing that those are institutions worthy of cultural and historical recognition because they have great significance to the way that Colorado grew.
It's looking at water in a completely different way, as an element that the community shares and is responsible for sharing equitably. It's connected to the land, and by virtue of the fact that the people are working the land, it's connected to the people and giving life to those people.
Building a civilization in the great American desert can be viewed as either a noble achievement or an act of hubris. To survive in this arid land requires technology, tenacity, and community. Scarcity of water can divide people with competing interests, but it can also bring them together in cooperative efforts to maintain a way of life amid the most challenging conditions.
The ancestral Pueblans had a far more restrictive environment than we have, and yet they were able to live there for hundreds of years. They respected their environment, they respected the inadequacies of that environment, and used up only what they needed.
Beginning in July of 1858 and lasting until roughly the creation of the Colorado Territory in 1861, some 100,000 dreamers stoked on get-rich-quick schemes stampeded westward to take part in one of the great mineral rushes in United States history, as gold fever went viral. Snowmelt from the Rockies was swirled in pans and run through sluices to separate gravel from flakes and nuggets of gold. After all the good claims along streams were taken, miners created diversion channels to send stream flow to dry piles of dirt and stone where their dreams of fortune lay buried. Hydraulic mining blasted water through canvas hoses to demolish hillsides, and specks of gold were separated from the muck. Because gold mining would come to a standstill without water, competition for limited supplies was intense, and water disputes were sometimes settled with the blade of a shovel or the bore of a gun. Colorado's South Platte River Basin, the site of the initial gold strike that started the stampede to Colorado, was scoffed at by people accustomed to the generous rivers of the East. Mark Twain wrote his impression of the South Platte on his travels to the Nevada silver mines. The Platte was up, they said, which made me wish I could see it when it was down, if it could look any sicker or sorrier. But the confluence of the South Platte and Cherry Creek had offered comfort to the Arapaho and Cheyenne, who pitched their teepees beneath the cottonwoods. And this wet crossroads was welcome relief to travelers who endured the punishing dryness of the Great Plains. From this faint oasis, Denver grew into a ramshackle boomtown, busy with brothels, saloons, gambling halls, and other businesses that aimed to mine the miners. All the grifters, drifters, shopkeepers, and fortune seekers needed to eat. But produce and beef were imported from hundreds of miles away, and fresh food was hard to come by. In 1859, Clear Creek was diverted to water a vegetable garden near Golden, setting Colorado's agricultural story in motion. But farming in the West presented a unique challenge that had to be met before the industry could thrive. In the humid East, rain fell with such frequency that there was no need to divert water from rivers for irrigation. But in the arid West, surface water shrank so low in late summer that a single farmer could empty a river. Without careful management of water, crops in this drought-prone land would vanish. Colorado needed a special system of water laws, a system that rewarded entrepreneurs who put scarce water resources to beneficial use. In 1870, Nathan Meeker, the agriculture editor of Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, followed the call to go west. On the plains of the Colorado Territory, where the city of Greeley would soon emerge, Meeker founded Union Colony, a utopian community nestled near the confluence of the Cache la Poudre and South Platte rivers. The settlement was based on temperance, religion, and cooperative irrigation.
First thing they did was to construct the Greeley No. 3 ditch from the Cache la Poudre River. Then in the dry summer of 1874, they noticed that their water supply was way lower than it had been the previous summers. And they got on their horses and rode from Greeley to modern-day Fort Collins. And to their horror, they saw that there were several irrigation ditches constructed to irrigate lands upstream.
So the settlers of the Union Colony said, can't you see we were here first? We rely on this water supply. Put the river back. Well, fortunately, it rained in August of 1874. But 2 years later, it rained a constitutional provision.
The first person to divert water from a river and put it to beneficial use has a senior right. In times of water scarcity, those with senior rights get all of their water first, and those with junior rights might be forced to use less water or none at all. Farmers and ranchers were usually at the head of the line. Next came industry and cities. The environmental and recreation communities generally showed up a century later, and they now wait at the end of a very long line.
first in time, first in right. That was essentially based on a capitalist idea that if you are going to risk your resources to build a dam or build a ditch or a reservoir, you should be able to have the first right to that water. That protects your investment.
In 1876, when Colorado was granted statehood, the system of prior appropriation was incorporated into the state constitution and became known as the Colorado Doctrine.
1996, the Cache-la-Poudre River became the first national heritage area in the state of Colorado and the first one west of the Mississippi River, primarily because of the birthplace of Western water law was right in the Cache-la-Poudre Basin in the 1870s.
In Coffin versus Left Hand Ditch Company, a landmark case decided in 1882, the Colorado Supreme Court upheld the doctrine of prior appropriation and affirmed that diverters have the legal right to move water from one basin to another, regardless of distance or geographic barriers. It was now clear that water could be moved far from the streams where it originates and be put to use anywhere in the state. Laws that evolved when wagon wheels creaked across the frontier continue to manage our most important resource. Many feel that this system has stood the test of time and contains the flexibility to adapt to changing demands in the future. Others argue that a water rights system established in the 1800s is in need of an overhaul. How this debate plays out in coming years will likely affect not just Colorado, but the entire American West. With the creation of the Office of the State Engineer in 1881, Colorado became the first state to provide for the distribution of water by public officials. Under the state constitution, water rights are property rights. They can be bought and sold.
Water allocation in Colorado is really just the good neighbor policy. You can use it in any way on one condition. You can't impact somebody who was there before you. It's no different than walking into a room. You can have any seat as long as it's an empty seat.
The most valuable property right in Colorado, dating to 1861, is of two parts. One, the right to take the water from the stream, and the right to, second part, cross the intervening private land to operate and maintain and develop your water right. It is an anti-speculation, anti-monopoly idea.
Beneficial use means putting water to use without waste. But if someone with a legal right to use a certain amount of water stops using that amount for a prescribed length of time, the water right can be forfeited. This makes hoarding water rights difficult, and it discourages water speculation. But the use it or lose it principle has the unintended consequence of discouraging water rights owners from using less water and leaving it in rivers to benefit recreation and the environment. This kind of tension between venerable legal principles and contemporary values lends added complexity to conflicts between competing water users.
Our movement of water is extremely difficult. You have to go to water court, you have to get a decree, you have to have expert witnesses, you have to have lawyers. Water goes a lot further if you agree over it than if you litigate over it.
Caliche High School is an 8-man football team, and they might get 20 boys out for football because it keeps shrinking. And a town to the north, Peets, has a 6-man football team. So you just have fewer and fewer people farming the land. You get more productivity per person, but fewer and fewer people that understand water and how it relates to the land.
The Homestead Act of 1862 opened vast tracts of land for settlement and sent a flood of people pouring westward across the plains. Pioneers found Colorado blessed with fertile soil and abundant sunshine, but cursed with dryness. Ditches were their salvation. Channels carved in dirt transformed prairie and mountain valleys into productive cropland and rich pasture land. and Coloradans mastered the subtle alchemy of turning soil, sun, and water into food.
They saw the potential that there was out there, that this water was going by so quickly from snowmelt. And they were thinking, well, you know, if we could just grab some of that water, then we could use it later in the season. They used horses, and they used shovels, and they used people, and they built these projects.
Benjamin Harrison Eaton settled with his family on a homestead in Weld County in 1864. By diverting the waters of the Cache la Poudre River into canals, Eaton developed an irrigation system from which personal wealth and political power flowed. In 1884, he was elected governor of the state of Colorado, and his administration strove to expand irrigation and farming. Eaton's irrigation achievements helped transform the prairie land of the South Platte River Valley into a lucrative agricultural industry. When the state's economy collapsed in the silver panic of 1893, a sugar beet boom helped fill the gaping hole left by abandoned mines. Each sugar mill silo rose in a white pillar from the plains and served as the hub of an agricultural community. Beet fields and processing factories fueled the prosperity of the South Platte and Arkansas basins. Today, most of the mills stand as silent reminders of a once powerful empire felled by competition from artificial sweeteners, corn syrup, and sugar cane.
Sugar City was the site of a sugar mill, and when the sugar market changed, speculators came in and bought up the water rights in the Colorado Canal. And then they remarketed those to Pueblo and Colorado Springs and Aurora. And those farmers and ranchers left. And the economic activity that was associated with their annual agricultural harvest and activity disappeared, you know, along with the grocery stores and the pharmacies and the car dealers and the farm implement dealers.
In the Arkansas and South Platte basins, manipulated water brought forth a bounty of fruits and vegetables. And what had been labeled the Great American Desert on the maps of explorers charting the westward course of empire soon morphed into a cornucopia that could help feed a growing nation. In the far west of the state, industrious pioneers diverted water from the Gunnison and Colorado rivers, turning desert lands into a paradise of orchards and vineyards circling the Grand Mesa from Palisade to Paonia. Near Mesa Verde, where voices of the ancients whisper through stands of wizened juniper, the Montezuma Valley beckoned settlers in the late 1800s to irrigate water-poor land rich with sunshine and cool nights. By 1920, an irrigation tunnel, canals, and wooden flumes channeled water from the Dolores River through a steep divide, and the Montezuma Valley bloomed with a bounty of fruits and grains. Alfalfa, after first being planted near Denver following the gold rush, soon spread to become the most important forage crop grown on irrigated land in Colorado, creating a booming beef industry that spanned the state. On the plains near Strasburg, Colorado, Frank Zyback became known as the father of center pivots. By sucking water up from underground aquifers and sprinkling it in a circle through rotating pipes, these sprinklers revolutionized irrigated farming throughout the West. In places beyond the circles of simulated rain, meticulous husbandry of water and land allows dryland farmers to produce a bounty of wheat, along with harvests of corn, sorghum, and millet without irrigation. But many portions of the plains and basins have been transformed by the circulatory system of ditches, watched over by vigilant guardians. Colorado's ditch riders have the crucial job of managing water flowing through the arteries that distribute the lifeblood of agricultural communities. Some of the ditches in their charge date back a century and a half. Practitioners of the storied profession of ditch riding, who once patrolled on horseback, now often ride motorcycles, ATVs, and pickups, still scoop debris from ditches, patch leaks, open and close head gates, and make sure all users receive the amount of water to which they are legally entitled, and in times of scarcity, not a drop more.
My grandpa was a ditch rider in the 60s, and I've rode the ditch for 22 years now. They're basically peacekeepers on the ditch system. Ditch riders are always in trouble when there's not enough water, and then it's always the ditch rider's fault when the shareholders' ditch washes out because there was too much water in the main canal.
Today, agriculture accounts for about 85% of all water use in Colorado. And that number can stir powerful feelings. Some see this large percentage as an indicator that agriculture could become more efficient. Others contend that farmers continue to make progress and that a large amount of water diverted for agriculture is not absorbed into crops and returns to the hydrologic system. The practice of cities purchasing water rights from farmers and ranchers, resulting in the dehydration of irrigated land, is known as buy and dry. This has always been one of the fastest and most reliable ways for urban areas spreading along the Front Range to boost their water supplies. And as population continues its meteoric increase in Colorado, there's mounting pressure to move more water from irrigated agriculture to municipalities. The increasing popularity of the locavore movement, which advocates for locally grown food to strengthen community, improve people's health, and reduce the environmental impacts of transporting food long distances, is adding new momentum to preserving Colorado's agricultural landscapes. To avoid buy and dry programs that trade hay meadows for shopping malls, cooperative deals known as alternative transfer methods allow farmers to temporarily lease their water to urbanized areas looking for liquid relief.
What this is meant to do is to try to keep water in agriculture, recognizing that it can be used for municipal uses or environmental uses in the future, but it just doesn't leave the land. It comes back, and it's only used for the time period that's necessary.
So the farmers would keep their irrigation water rights. They would be compensated for the equivalent of the water that they're giving. And also, when you do rotational fallowing, you actually can improve the productivity of your farm operation.
But in reality, farmland continues to be dried up as the cities that swell along Colorado's Front Range decide they prefer the certainty of purchasing senior water rights to relying on complicated water-sharing deals. And as farmers age, the sale of water rights is often regarded as their retirement fund.
I think people truly treasure some of the drives where they look out and see rolling fields of hay bales until one of those farms sells its water, and then all of a sudden it's a field of dust and weeds.
So do you want a state devoid of agriculture? I don't think so. Agriculture defines Colorado economically, culturally. It's de facto open space, it's wildlife habitat, it's food security.
We're finding out that we're really more dependent on one another than we would like to admit sometimes. Rural Colorado needs our urban brothers and sisters. I would like to think that the urban dweller sees us in the same light.
I used to be an orthodox card-carrying humanities academic with contempt for the manipulations of nature and life that engineers perpetrated. And then I realized how much a beneficiary I was of those perpetrations.
During the 1870s and 80s, 10 companies in Denver fought, folded, and merged in a chaotic scramble to control the young city's wooden water pipes. As Denver's population swelled from fewer than 5,000 people in 1870 to over 100,000 in 1890, the city was plagued by water shortages and by poor sanitation that caused cholera and typhoid outbreaks. Cheeseman Dam on the South Platte River above Denver was seen as a solution to the city's problems of water quantity and quality. When completed in 1905, this structure rose 221 feet above the stream bed, the tallest dam in the world at the time. And it stored a supply of pure mountain water far removed from the contaminants of the gritty city on the plains below. Denver Water, one of the oldest water utilities in the western United States, was established in 1918 when Denver residents who wanted water out of the control of private for-profit entities voted to create a municipal water utility. The Denver Water Board was soon faced with finding a new supply to meet the needs of a city straining to grow from a mining supply town into a prairie metropolis. In 1936, after the federal government footed the bill to build an aqueduct during the hard years of the Great Depression, the Moffett Tunnel brought a surge of cold, pure water to the thirsty city. This engineering triumph helped usher in an era of major trans-basin diversions from the water-rich West Slope to the cities and farms of the water-poor East Slope. Denver Water's chief counsel, Glenn Saunders, served as the public face of the organization from the late 1930s to the early 1970s. In his quest to help the city satiate its thirst, Saunders made clear that Colorado water law allowed for Denver to legally divert as much flow from the headwaters of the Colorado River as it could put to beneficial use. But disgruntled citizens on the West Slope labeled the largest municipal water provider in the state an imperial bully, and talk of coming water wars circulated across the Great Divide. Following World War II, Denver's population boomed, sending water demand soaring, and sending Denver's engineers to the West Slope to secure more supply. To create Dillon Reservoir, the entire town of Dillon in Summit County had to be relocated out of the path of the engineered flood. But Denver faced a challenge more daunting than moving a town. To store Blue River water behind Dillon Dam and divert it to the city, Denver Water had to engage in a long and bruising battle with the federal government and West Slope water districts. In 1955, a compromise known as the Blue River Decree was finally hammered out. And 7 years later, the 23.3-mile Harold D. Roberts Tunnel joined the state's long list of notable engineering achievements. Infrastructure of impressive scale has been built not just to span the spine of the continent, but also to cross divides that separate arid West Slope valleys from locales with more bounteous flows. The Gunnison Tunnel served as the centerpiece of the Uncompahgre project, which created an engineered Eden by slicing a hole nearly 6 miles long through the cliffs of the Black Canyon. When dedicated by President William Howard Taft in 1909, the Gunnison Tunnel was the longest irrigation tunnel in the world and marked the beginning of the reclamation era in Colorado. Congress created the Reclamation Service in 1902, later renamed the Bureau of Reclamation, to reclaim arid lands for human use. In order to transform the dry terrain of the West into bountiful farmland, large-scale irrigation was essential. And to provide a steady water supply for irrigation, the West's cycles of water surplus and shortage had to be smoothed out with storage. The Bureau of Reclamation deployed some of the world's most talented engineers to the West, and structures of stunning scale fulfilled a human dream that had spanned millennia: the mastery of rivers. Dropping more than 14,000 feet as it journeys from the snows of the Rocky Mountains to the Sea of Cortez, the mercurial Colorado River takes on many personalities. Over the course of its 1,450-mile odyssey through the dry heart of the American West, the Colorado provides water for some 40 million people in the United States and Mexico, many of whom live outside the river's natural course, in cities exploding with growth. The metro areas that use Colorado River water have a combined economy that is the 12th largest in the world. A virtual nation that generates more than $1.7 trillion in gross metropolitan product a year and supports millions of jobs. Hydropower facilities on this workhorse of a waterway help the West meet its power needs. Some 70% of the Colorado's flow is siphoned off to nearly 4 million acres of irrigated lands, which produce half of the nation's fruits, nuts, and vegetables. 22 Native American tribes rely on the Colorado. 7 national wildlife refuges and 11 national parks depend on the river to support ecosystems and a multi-billion-dollar recreation industry that draw visitors from around the world. In Colorado, the namesake river supplies water to most of the state's 5 million people, sustains agriculture on both sides of the divide, supports ranch communities and mountain towns on the west slope, and allows for urban growth along the Front Range. It is also seen as a key source of water to support Colorado's future population increase. But climate change threatens to reduce the river's flow, and the state is limited in how much Colorado River water it can use by the most important water agreement in the American Southwest, the Colorado River Compact. Delph Carpenter, known as the Silver Fox of the Rockies, was instrumental in bringing the historic Colorado River Compact into being.
Nothing could have been constructed on the headwaters of the Colorado River if all of the states of the Colorado River, the 7 states, hadn't agreed to some distribution of the water beforehand. California was interested in taking a very large portion of the Colorado River and diverting it to the Imperial Valley.
Delph Carpenter and others said, if we don't do something, then California and Arizona, the big irrigation districts, and Los Angeles would have all of the senior rights to the Colorado River. And they wanted to develop additional water within Colorado, but they knew it would be years before the demands for that water came about. Well, the lower basin wanted Lake Mead. Why? Because Lake Mead was a way to regulate the river, to control the floods, to provide a stable water supply for projects that would divert water into the Imperial Irrigation District or Los Angeles. So the lower basin states wanted support in Congress from all of the basin states for the authorization of Lake Mead. The upper division states wanted California to say, we will only take so much water and we will leave water for you to use in the future. So we had this natural compromise.
The Colorado River was divided at Lee's Ferry in northern Arizona, creating an upper basin, which includes Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and a lower basin, made up of Nevada, Arizona, and California. The Compact of 1922 laid the foundation for the federal government to build massive infrastructure projects that turned the nation's wildest river into a managed piece of water machinery. The Colorado River Compact is now one of 9 interstate compacts that determine how the state of Colorado shares water with downstream states. Up to 2/3 of the surface water that originates in Colorado must be delivered to other states and Mexico. Conflicts over these agreements continue to this day. During the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression of the 1930s, leaders in drought-stricken northeastern Colorado, desperate for additional water, dreamed of an enormous project to divert flow from the Colorado River headwaters across the Continental Divide. The Bureau of Reclamation was eager to help, guided now by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal policies to put massive public works projects in motion. But before the fields of northeastern Colorado could receive liquid relief, warring factions on opposite sides of the divide had to reach a compromise. Towns and farmers on the west slope tended to view efforts to redirect their rivers to the east as theft on a grand scale.
West Slope was very diverse and underpopulated. So what did we do? The state legislature created the Colorado River Water Conservation District so the West Slope could act and fund itself collaboratively, and it created the Colorado Water Conservation Board so there was a statewide forum where these things could be discussed. And the Conservancy District Act that allowed the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District to be created.
Northern Water worked with the federal government to contract for and then build and operate the Colorado Big Thompson Project, the largest trans-basin water diversion in the state. Known as the CBT Project, this masterwork helped cement the reputation of the Bureau of Reclamation as the world's preeminent civil engineering organization. In 1944, the two ends of the Alva B. Adams Tunnel, the linchpin of the CBT, were connected with a blast of dynamite beneath the alpine wilderness of Rocky Mountain National Park. The Adams Tunnel was bored 13.1 miles through the core of the Continental Divide. When the two tunneling teams met near the middle, their alignment was off by the mere width of a coin. When the CBT project was completed in 1956, the flow from the Colorado River headwaters provided a steroidal boost to agriculture in northeastern Colorado. West Slope water flows by gravity from Grand Lake through the half marathon of the Adams Tunnel, drops nearly 2,900 vertical feet down the east slope, and then cascades through 6 power plants to generate electricity. The project spans some 250 miles and consists of a dozen reservoirs, 18 dams and dikes, hundreds of miles of siphons and pipes, a spiderweb of power lines, a dizzying array of tunnels and pumps, all combined in an assemblage of hydraulic machinery so complicated it would make Rube Goldberg's head spin.
A lot of people ask about what's impressive about the Colorado Big Thompson project. My answer to that is absolutely everything. The Colorado Big Thompson project is like adding an additional Poudre River into this area that has made Weld County the largest producing agricultural county in the state of Colorado, ranks in the top 10 nationwide. Several of the top agricultural counties are located in northeastern Colorado.
Is that the President of the United States is flying from Washington, D.C. to Colorado to dedicate the Frying Pan, Arkansas project in 1962. I was about, let's say 9 years old. All of the community were so excited just to see a president.
The President of the United States.
Little did I know then what I know now about the project that I manage. It was a very special moment to see him and to listen to his words.
We are finally on our way to diverting water through the Continental Divide into the Arkansas River Basin. I salute the statesmanship of the leaders on both sides of the mountain. This is an investment in the future of this country, an investment that will repay large dividends. It is an investment in the growth of the West. This country will continue its march forward. Thank you.
The Frying Pan Arkansas Project, also known as FryArk, is southeastern Colorado's counterpart to the CBT project. The Bureau of Reclamation began constructing the Trans-Basin Diversion in 1964, continuing the monumental process of replumbing the state's river basins. Completed in 1981, the FryArk project diverted flow from the Frying Pan and other tributaries of the Roaring Fork River, sending water under the Continental Divide to fill the irrigation ditches of the Arkansas Valley and boost municipal supply for Pueblo, Colorado Springs, and Aurora. FryArk supported urban and suburban growth along the southern Front Range. And as some Coloradans cheered the economic prosperity, others jeered the area for morphing into a megalopolis with multiple straws, sucking the rivers of the West Slope dry. Wayne Aspinall, a Palisade peach grower, lawyer, and state legislator, served for several decades as a strong and steady voice for water development in Colorado. As a Democratic congressman representing the West Slope, Aspinall worked his way into powerful positions in Washington. And from the mid-1950s to the early 1970s, he used every means at his disposal to make sure that the state of Colorado in general, and the West Slope in particular, received their Colorado River compact share of water. In the Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park, cataracts crash through the canyon where the river trenched some 2,000 feet into solid depths of stone. But the Gunnison River's rambunctious flow is now controlled by a series of dams. The Wayne N. Aspinall Storage Unit consists of 3 dams, including Blue Mesa Dam, which created Blue Mesa Reservoir, the largest body of water in the state of Colorado. Along with Morrow Point and Crystal Dams, the 3 dams of the Aspinall unit developed water storage and hydroelectric power across a 40-mile section of the river, regulating the Gunnison to provide irrigation and power for West Slope farms and towns, and creating recreational opportunities on the flat water of the reservoirs. The water projects in the Colorado River Basin that Wayne Aspinall championed turned the Colorado and its tributaries into tamer beasts, or stronger workhorses, depending on one's point of view. Aspinall's legacy now straddles the sometimes sharp divide between proponents of water development, who continue to view him as a hero who helped develop the arid West, and environmental activists who tend to see him as an ecological villain responsible for a spasm of destructive dam building. Located in northwestern Colorado at the confluence of the Green and Yampa Rivers in Dinosaur National Monument, Echo Park was the site of a proposed dam authorized in legislation sponsored by Wayne Aspinall. The towering construction would have created a reservoir drowning parts of the national monument and burying stretches of wild canyon country, which sparked a battle in the 1950s between the Bureau of Reclamation, led by legendary dam builder Floyd Dominy, and the Sierra Club, helmed by David Brower, one of the environmental movement's patron saints. The project was eventually canceled, and the anti-dam momentum set in motion by the Echo Park controversy led to the 1964 Wilderness Act and the genesis of the modern environmental movement.
David Brower said, "Would you flood the Sistine Chapel to get closer to the ceiling?" Going down into Dinosaur, you do get that feeling of, all of that could have been flooded. You'd be at the top of the walls, and the canyon would have been lost. The Yampa is one of the last remaining wild rivers in our country.
Following World War II, the growing importance of tourism and outdoor recreation as economic drivers of Colorado's economy shaped a strong argument for allocating some of the state's scarce water resources for snowmaking, rafting, and preserving wild rivers and wetlands. Dams that had previously been viewed as laudable monuments of civilization came under increasing scrutiny for disrupting the natural world and causing a host of unintended consequences. Scientists pointed out that these sources of water storage served as silt traps, starving rivers of structure and nutrients. They also created vast water surfaces in some of the most arid places on Earth, causing enormous amounts of water to evaporate. And the disappearance of plants and animals in rivers and along their shores was viewed with increasing alarm as a sign that all creatures connected to watersheds, including humans, faced an uncertain future.
Everything we value in Colorado and in the West depends on rivers. Our vibrant cities, our wonderful agricultural heritage, our landscapes. If we take care of nature, nature takes care of us.
I think tourism is so important to the state of Colorado. To damage the image of us being anything but a pristine environment damages the whole state. Delivering water is more than collecting it, treating it, and distributing. You have to also look after the basin of origin where that water came from.
National grassroots citizens movements dedicated to raising awareness about environmental issues resulted in a spate of federal legislation that aimed to protect and preserve the natural environment and fundamentally changed the way water was managed in the West. Proposed dam projects stalled as scientists studied the associated impacts in detail. Citizens began engaging in the water decision-making process, entering what had previously been the province of engineers and other specialists. And the protection of imperiled rivers and endangered species became a national priority. Early in the environmental era, the 1968 National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was authorized by Congress to preserve free-flowing rivers.
Cache-la-Poudre River was the first wild and scenic river designated in the state of Colorado. It's still the only wild and scenic river in the state.
The Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program came together in 1988 through the collective effort of a wide-ranging cast of characters, environmental groups, and local, state, and federal agencies. This included water users represented by the Colorado Water Congress, established in 1958 as the principal voice of Colorado's water community.
We've completely disrupted the natural cycle of this river system, so it doesn't send the cues to fish to spawn. We have about 42 native fish species that live in the Colorado River Basin. Of those 42, about 50% have either gone extinct already or are imperiled.
Some of the most dramatic impacts of the Trans-Basin diversion can be found down below the Windy Gap Reservoir. 100% of the stonefly have disappeared. 100% of the sculpin, which is a little fish that the trout like to eat, have disappeared.
We can argue with a fair bit of evidence that when you start putting the fish at risk, it's kind of a canary in the coal mine. So it's an indicator that other things may be broken in this system.
Another subtle aspect of the environmental movement lies buried beneath our feet in hidden worlds of groundwater. In the 1960s, while the word limits was on the lips of environmentalists, water managers acknowledged that the state's groundwater resources are not without limits. Treating groundwater and surface water supplies that are linked together as a single system was a forward-thinking move that set Colorado apart from other states. Yet many groundwater challenges remain in Colorado. Aquifers that took nature millennia to fill are being drained in half a human lifetime. The Republican River, the only river in the state that doesn't have its headwaters in the Rockies, rises from the high plains of eastern Colorado, where droughts are common and rain is erratic. Agriculture in the Republican River Basin relies on groundwater pumped from the Ogallala Aquifer. Once large enough to fill Lake Erie 9 times over, the aquifer is rapidly being depleted, a critical threat to the future of Great Plains farming.
A few years back, Kansas said Nebraska and Colorado were keeping too much water upstream and had to pay it back. All the reservoir's water is about to flow down the Republican River and out of Colorado.
Bonnie Reservoir is the graphic representation of our sacrifice out there. That was a tough call that had to be made in order to solve the compact issues. There was no way to deal with the losses we were being charged for the seepage and evaporation without having that reservoir empty. Our issue in the basin right now is conservation. How long can we make the aquifer last? The real question is, how do we use our water in a sustainable way to preserve our economies, our businesses, and our way of life into the future? We have to be stewards of the ground, stewards of the water, stewards of all our resources, so that when the water comes, we can hold the water rather than have it run off.
The Great Sand Dunes, one of the West's most iconic landscapes, is held together by the glue of underground water. In the 1980s and 90s, a commercial plan to send water from the underlying aquifer to the growing cities and suburbs of the Front Range threatened the water security of the valley and the entire dunes system. Residents of the San Luis Valley fought back in a grassroots effort that included the Nature Conservancy and led to the establishment of Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve in 2004, safeguarding the underground water that nourishes wetlands teeming with life and supports the agricultural production of surrounding communities. But persistent drought and irrigation wells have seriously depleted the groundwater in the San Luis Valley.
Available water in the valley is constrained by the Rio Grande Compact. The amount of water that is currently being consumed exceeds the long-term sustainable water supply in the valley. And as a result, the people who live there are going to have to make some very hard decisions and are in the process of making those decisions.
So now we're in the new normal. It's dry. My hope for the San Luis Valley is that we can learn to live within our means, be able to show some restraint, some self-discipline on our well pumping.
Managing the myriad connections to water born of the natural world and of human constructs requires a new kind of thinking that is actually quite old. Holistic water management is nothing new to acequia farmers. By the power of gravity and through the hard human work of maintaining cooperative institutions, water flows through the community ditches of the San Luis Valley. Along with growing food and building connections among people, the ditches provide vital ecosystem services. The acequias preserve corridors of wildlife habitat, promote soil conservation, and protect water quality. One of the most notable expressions of the environmental movement in Colorado was a flurry of effort to clean up the state's abused waterways. By the 1960s, the South Platte River had become a waste dump and an embarrassment to Denver. Since 1974, the Greenway Foundation has reclaimed much of the trash land along the South Platte River, transforming it into a place of civic pride. Likewise, across the state, rivers that had become eyesores now boast beautiful pathways and whitewater parks. In the 1960s and 70s, as more and more Coloradans connected with rivers, the state's many water quality challenges came under increasing scrutiny. Water that is too salty kills the crops of farmers. Runoff from lawns and farms pollutes rivers, and traction sand spread on winter highways smothers the spawning beds of trout in mountain streams. Widespread concern over keeping water clean, safe, and cool led to the Colorado Water Quality Control Act of 1972. In 1973, in response to growing environmental concerns among the public, an in-stream flow program was created within the Colorado Water Conservation Board. The concept of beneficial use, which had previously meant diverting water out of a river, was expanded to include allowing water to remain in a river for the benefit of fish, wildlife, and healthy ecosystems. And in the first decade of the 21st century, the concept of beneficial use was further broadened as Colorado included recreational flows.
Well, there's plenty of flexibility and adaptability in the law, even though the resource is always very scarce. We have kayak course water rights now, in-stream flow water rights.
I think it's balancing the playing field. Since 1973, the Colorado Water Conservation Board has appropriated over 1,500 water rights on more than 9,000 miles of stream. And that's about a quarter of the perennial streams in the state, which is very significant in terms of protections for the environment in the western states.
But some environmentalists insist that the in-stream flow laws aren't robust enough to protect the natural environment. They cite as evidence waterways such as the Crystal River that have in-stream flow rights but are drained as dry as gravel roads during times of drought when diverters with senior rights irrigate their fields. In the 1970s, as a surge of legislative activity at the federal and state levels was making it more difficult to dam and divert rivers, the Animas La Plata project in southwestern Colorado moved forward at a crawl. Designed and built by the Bureau of Reclamation, the Animas La Plata project was originally authorized by Congress in 1968. For nearly 4 decades, the project was the subject of fierce public debate, cost overruns, and endless delays. In 1998, the Department of the Interior issued a recommendation for a substantially scaled-down project, which was still a behemoth water project with a price tag of $500 million. But the final version was designed mainly to satisfy Native American water rights, a pressing issue throughout the American West. The people who were the first to use water in Western lands have often been the last to obtain a stable supply, until another Bureau of Reclamation effort provided relief to the people of the Ute Mountain Ute Indian Reservation in 1994. They were forced to rely on trucks from Cortez to bring in treated drinking water.
The Dolores Project provided the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe water to irrigate 7,600 acres of land, and indeed that has allowed for all the commercial and residential expansion that is ongoing in the Toyoak community.
In 2012, Bureau of Reclamation officials pronounced Lake Nighthorse Reservoir full, providing additional water for the Ute Mountain Ute and for the Southern Ute Reservation and the Navajo Nation. The Animas La Plata project was finally complete, and a modern piece of infrastructure bridged an age-old divide between early Coloradans and a culture that had overturned their nomadic world.
It's probably one of the last major Bureau of Reclamation type facilities you'll see in quite some time built in this area, for sure, maybe this state or possibly the country.
In the 1980s, Denver didn't look to the Bureau of Reclamation for funding when the city and most of the suburbs in the metropolitan area joined together to pay for and build a mega dam themselves. Two Forks Dam, a proposed 615-foot-tall, $1 billion project on the South Platte River southwest of Denver, was seen as a source of water to supply the anticipated growth of the city and its surrounding suburbs. But the dam would have flooded more than 30 miles of free-flowing river, burying scenic Cheeseman Canyon under a reservoir, and destroying a world-class trout fishery that the director of Colorado Trout Unlimited called our holy water. Widespread opposition to the dam was led by the Colorado Environmental Caucus. A hydrologist and former Notre Dame quarterback named Daniel Lukey spearheaded the development of a detailed plan. Lukey's team amassed reams of technical data, demonstrating that Denver's water shortfall could be made up with conservation and more efficient use, along with smaller storage projects. And in 1990, the Environmental Protection Agency vetoed Two Forks Dam.
The environmental community had demonstrated we can have an effect on these debates. We can have an effect on these kinds of larger issues. But it's important that we offer something in exchange. We can't merely say we're saving the Sistine Chapel. We have to be more deliberate about changes that we make and the consequences of those changes.
The EPA's veto was widely viewed as a turning point in the history of water development in Colorado and throughout the West. Denver and its suburbs were forced to make up for the storage deficit by adopting unglamorous but effective strategies, such as metering residential water use, constructing small supply projects, sharing water across government boundaries, and reusing water.
So there is this organization after 1990 and the Two Forks veto, just with no game plan, no plan B. So the Denver Water Board chose someone very different from anybody who had ever led in that agency. Chip Sperry had come from a most diverse background. He'd grown up in Denver, he'd gone to Yale, he went to a tiny village in Alaska, and he provided legal aid. He'd been the director of the Department of Natural Resources, and his temperament was not like anything seen before, so he could go to the Western Slope and say, I represent an adolescent agency, and it is time for it to grow up.
As a new era of cooperation seemed to dawn, environmentalists started to speak like water managers, and water managers began touting the principles of environmentalists. It became difficult to find anyone wearing white hats or black hats. Many Coloradans donned hats of gray as they acknowledged their shared interest in seeking balance between developing their water resources and preserving the health of the rivers that run down the Great Divide.
We have 4,000 miles of watershed. Their health is just as important to us as the resource manager as it is to the Western Slope, because we need to have that water supply for as long as Denver exists. We're looking out 100 years or more in terms of the sustainability of our ability to manage this resource.
Though there are countless cases of cooperation in the Colorado water world, conflict is always bubbling beneath the surface. In the South Platte River Basin, where water moves in a coupled system between the river and the aquifer, severe drought in 2002 led to a fierce clash between farmers diverting from the South Platte River who had senior water rights and farmers pumping from the aquifer who had junior rights. As the pumpers drew from the shallow aquifer, the river shrank, and diverters couldn't send water to their fields. In one of the most controversial water rights decisions in Colorado's recent history, a court order in 2003 shut down wells to protect the senior water rights, and the crops of pumpers withered in the heat. The epic dryness of 2002 served as a wake-up call to Colorado. In 2003, the Colorado legislature authorized the statewide water supply initiative, This comprehensive study revealed a growing gap between water supply and demand, prompting statewide action. The Colorado Water for the 21st Century Act, passed in 2005, was inspired by Delph Carpenter's vision of negotiating the Colorado River Compact to avoid long and costly court battles among states with competing interests. The legislation established the Interbasin Compact Committee to facilitate dialogue among sections of the state with divided water interests. It also created 9 basin roundtables, one for each of the state's major river basins and one for the Denver metropolitan area. The idea was to open up water conversations to the public so that a broad range of stakeholders could meet face-to-face and work toward consensus on how to manage the state's contested waters. In response to the drought of 2002, Denver Water proposed expanding Gross Reservoir in the foothills of Boulder County, a project designed to divert more water from the West Slope. In 2013, the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, a historic pact forged between 18 parties after 6 years of effort to find common ground, created a framework for resolving disputes over the use of the Colorado River headwaters. The hard-won agreement allowed Denver Water to gain support for the expansion of Gross Reservoir. Trout Unlimited and Grand County have joined with Denver Water to work together toward the common goal of improving the health of the Fraser River watershed, while allowing Denver Water to increase the amount of its diversions in high water years.
And if we find that it's not succeeding, Denver is willing to obligate themselves to find another way to make this learning by doing work. That's the largest, most progressive step in East Slope, West Slope negotiations that has taken place, and not only in my lifetime, before I even was born.
Nevertheless, some environmental groups continue to oppose the project, based on concerns over anticipated damage to the already heavily depleted Colorado River headwaters and predicted local community impacts of the dam expansion. The Windy Gap Firming Project, proposed by Northern Water, is also designed to divert more flow from the Colorado River headwaters, and it too has generated many years of controversy. If both projects move forward as planned, some 3/4 of the native flow of the Colorado River headwaters will be diverted to the Front Range. And from a slender thread of wetness, the health of the upper reaches of the state's namesake river will hang. Northern Water's proposed Northern Integrated Supply Project is another plan that seems stuck in limbo. It includes 2 proposed reservoirs designed to store water now leaving the state in years of abundance. Opponents of the proposed Glade Reservoir north of Fort Collins claim it will harm the lower Cache La Poudre River. Supporters assert that constructing Glade is essential in order to provide a new water supply for the rapidly growing region. And they insist that because the reservoir is off-stream, it won't damage the river, and any impacts of the project will be mitigated. In 2013, Governor Hickenlooper signed an executive order directing the Colorado Water Conservation Board to begin work on a Colorado water plan to elucidate the state's water values and provide a blueprint for Colorado's water future. The drafting process brought the collaborative approach and citizen participation of the Interbasin Compact Committee and the Basin Roundtables into the larger circle of statewide cooperation.
It's allowed the different interests in each of the basins to come together on a regular basis, do an evaluation of what their assets are and what their needs for the future are and how they're going to accomplish them, and they're putting it together and that will become an important part of the overall state plan.
We have these values that we all as Coloradans agree on. You know, a vibrant ski industry and productive agriculture and thriving rivers and watersheds, and then also robust cities. So best case scenario, it continues to build on this collaborative exercise of getting people working together and trusting one another. That, we're thinking of ourselves as a state and we're going to do right by Colorado.
Water is probably the most important single issue that affects everybody in Colorado. I think what we're building in the water plan is something that will have a material benefit even at the middle of the century. I can guarantee you that if we're all working together and we've been preparing and planning, that no matter what comes at us, that we as a state can be prepared as best as possible.
Colorado's present population is projected to double sometime around 2050, and its water resources are predicted to decrease due to climate change, leading to a looming gap on the near horizon. How Colorado chooses to address the gap will, to a large degree, determine the state's future. Several new large-scale diversion projects have been proposed in recent years, such as pipelines from Flaming Gorge Reservoir in the Mississippi River. The Yampa River Pumpback Project would divert flow from the Yampa River to the Front Range.
We have some threats being voiced very loudly from the east slope of Colorado that they would like to see water be transferred from our valley. And I think it has wakened all of us to the fact that there's some big thoughts and some big money out there that could really drastically change this valley.
Opponents of mega projects contend that Colorado's water supply gap should be filled not by building costly new structures, but by finding alternatives such as water conservation, water recycling, transferring agricultural water to cities on an as-needed basis, and land use planning that creates urban centers that grow upward rather than outward.
It's only recent that we started talking about water being an important resource for the environment and recreation and agriculture and municipalities and industrial uses, all on an equal playing field. And the projects that are going to happen today and in the future are going to have to address all of those water values.
Much has already been accomplished through conservation efforts to reduce pressure on the state's beleaguered water supplies. Denver Water used 20% less water in 2014 than it did before 2002, even though the population of its service area had increased. But even more can be done to reduce water use in cities and in agriculture. A varied menu of strategies exists to promote water conservation, from improving the efficiency of urban delivery systems to implementing drip irrigation systems in agriculture, from xeriscaping that uses Colorado-friendly plants to rebate programs that incentivize consumers to switch to water-saving appliances.
We can reasonably rely, to a significant extent, on water conservation in order to help meet our future needs. 25%, 35% of our future water needs could be met by conservation.
The Prairie Waters Project in Aurora diverts water from the South Platte River, uses it, treats it at a wastewater plant, and releases it back into the river. Then the city draws water out of riverbank wells farther downstream, purifies it, and uses it again. This renewable water loop reduces the need to import water from other river basins.
The experience of Aurora could be something that would be a blueprint for the state and other agencies to look to. What we put in place here was what you would see in the Great Lakes states, certainly what you see in Europe, but this was the first time that it had been put together here in the Rocky Mountain region.
Without water, there is no life. And without careful management of water, Colorado can lose the environment that makes its quality of life famous the world over. The combination of cosmopolitan urban centers with rural heritage and magnificent wild places is a rare balance that rests on the careful stewardship of water. The next generation of water leaders, like the ones who came before them, will need to plan carefully, innovate boldly, work relentlessly in order to meet the water challenges of their day. The state which profoundly influenced water law across the region's arid lands can now lead the New West by example. Crafting smart water policies for the 21st century will be the legacy today's Coloradans leave for future citizens of Colorado, the West, and the world.
We live at the most extraordinary time in the history of the world. We're the generation when we have 1 foot in the campfire and 1 foot in the nuclear fire, and the natural world and the human world have to work together, which is very difficult because we're in a culture that's based on the concept of expanding.
The future is going to look very different than the past. As stewards of this resource, we really have to work together in order to create a future that works for the whole state of Colorado. I've seen a very big shift in the number of people at the table, the voices that are being listened to, the transparency that exists now.
I think the Living West exhibit illustrates that sometimes it requires major changes in our lifestyle, even in our culture, in order to live sustainably in a place like Colorado. There are solutions out there, but to reach for them sometimes requires us to entirely rethink the way that we live. If people don't talk to each other and negotiate their needs in the water table game, then nobody gets enough water, or one group gets water at the expense of another group. You can't win this game by yourself.
So the question then becomes, how do you manage the continued growth of Colorado and the increased need for water against the diminishing supply of water?
There's going to be a new awareness of the value of water, which is currently lacking, and that's a good thing, actually.
Because water is the one resource humans cannot live without, it is almost inevitable that solutions to 21st century water problems will continue to support the survival of civilization in the arid West. Whether Colorado's rivers can be preserved as healthy systems that nourish the hearts and minds of future generations remains a vexing question.
It took a lot of engineering to make Colorado what it is today, but it also takes a lot of humility. It requires us to understand that there are limits to our dreams, limits to our aspirations, but knowing that we live in a landscape that can change on a dime, knowing that we live in a place where the best we can ever do is negotiate with nature, not conquer it, that gives us a realistic chance to create a better future for everyone.
Wind was blowing off the Sangre de Cristo up and over the divide. We were driving down the highway 285. It was hot as hell at the tail end of August. I can still remember when I smelled them pines over cool mountain water, felt that river on my skin. Still in midnight shadows, I'm swimming in my sleep in the Colorado River deep. That golden light
on Masterpiece.
I thought we'd go to that hotel I mentioned.
Don't understand why you won't fight.
I don't want to kill anyone, Claire.
But let's not pretend Bob doesn't hate you. You're wrong.
Well, why don't you allow me to cook you supper?
Well, no man has ever offered to cook me supper before.
Get to a shelter! Is this a drill? Bob!
Home Fires on Masterpiece.
Sunday at 8 on Rocky Mountain PBS.
Did you know that Rocky Mountain PBS and I were born around the same time? As a native Coloradan, I grew up with this incredible programming and learned things that helped shape my life. Now the station is turning 60, and me, well, let's just say I'm not far behind. Rocky Mountain PBS is 60 years young, full of vigor, innovation, and most importantly, a continuing commitment to you. I hope kids watching today will learn, just as I did, that the sky's the limit. Happy birthday, Rocky Mountain PBS.
Next time on I'll Have What Phil's Having.
I can stuff my face guilt-free.
I'm finding some of the best food in the world.
Wow, this is good.
Right in my adopted hometown, Los Angeles.
That's my entrance.
You're lucky we're on camera.
And I'm bringing some of my favorite locals along for the ride. All this and more on the next I'll Have What Phil's Having.
Los Angeles, right? Not so bad. Hey, sir.
Monday at 9 on Rocky Mountain PBS.
George came into the world like every other baby. He was perfectly healthy. At the beginning of first grade, George started talking about feeling different from other kids. He was saying, you know, so-and-so doesn't want to play with me. As a mom, that's painful. You know, this is a kid that I love with my whole heart. The day that we had George's diagnosis, my husband said, we love him, now we get to love him better. I had gone online, and when I stumbled upon Arthur introduces a new character with Asperger's syndrome, my jaw just dropped. Like, wow. Wow. He was like, oh my goodness, this is a story about me. There's always going to be somebody who's different. Having a TV station like PBS that highlights those things and finds the beauty in them is so important. It's so important.
Coming up, a groundbreaking investigation of his burial reveals what happened to Tutankhamun after he died.
There's just so many things wrong in terms of royal mummification.
We have an explanation for the charring on the mummy.
Ultimate Tut on Secrets of the Dead.
Tuesday at 7 on Rocky Mountain PBS.
PBS has always played a big part in my being a good citizen. When the Watergate hearings began, PBS was thoughtful enough to rear them at night. So it was a great service to all of us who were busy with children during the day. Frontline, the News Hour. I really love Washington Week. I trust the news programs on PBS. I decided to do a planned gift because I want to ensure that PBS will be around for my grandchildren and hopefully great-grandchildren. I would hope that others, when doing their estate planning, would include their PBS station. My PBS station is part of my community. That's something I really value.
There are some wonders which stand out as the most extreme, and they're places which test their inhabitants to the limit.
Wednesday at 7 on Rocky Mountain PBS. Due to the length of the